All right, guys, so the dress we're gonna make in today's video almost didn't get made. And if you watch, you're gonna see why, because disaster almost struck really early on. But I learned some really important lessons along the way, and I think they're probably gonna help you too. So I'm gonna share 3 important tips for working on the bias, because today we're making a beautiful 1930s inspired bias cut dress for spring. So let's make this dress together, and stay tuned to the end because I'm going to recap all the tips for you at the end. And I'm also going to share the #1 most important lesson I learned while making this beauty. So let's start sewing. All right, so today we're going to be sewing together the first dress in my spring wardrobe. If you didn't see the video on what I'm planning to sew for spring, you can check that video out. We'll link it in the description below. It goes through the whole design process that I use to create my plans for sewing for spring. So the first garment we're going to be making together is the Grace dress, and I'm going to be doing some modifications to it to give it a little bit more of a vintage vibe. But first I wanted to show you the fabric I got for it. So I picked up this fabric locally at Mill End, which is a local fabric store. And originally I wanted to get a silk. I wanted to make like a silk slinky bias cut dress. But when I saw this, I just fell in love. It's this gorgeous sky blue color that just reminds me of a spring sky. I'm so excited to wear this and for it to be spring. So I just fell in love with it, and it has a really cool texture to it. It's a rayon fabric, and it has this sort of diagonal rib texture to it. Makes it a little bit springy, especially before it's ironed or pressed. So it's got a little bit of springiness to it, and I'm curious to see how that's going to behave when it's cut on the bias. So I'm going to be making the Grace dress, like I said, and I'm going to be doing some modifications to it to give it a little bit more of a vintage vibe. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be adding gathers under the bust just to give it a little bit more fullness in the cups, and that's going to give it kind of that 1930s slip dress sort of look to it. What I really love about the Grace dress is it has instead of having spaghetti straps like a lot of slip dresses, it has a thicker shoulder, or a wider shoulder rather, so it will cover bra straps, which makes it very, very wearable. But one other modification I want to do to it is I want to lower the neckline just a little bit. I just think it'll look really nice with the gathers under the bust. All right, so I decided to cut a size 6. I'm pretty much between sizes. I'm between a size 4 and a size 6 usually, and I've decided for this one I'm going to cut a size 6 and see how that goes. One of the great things about this dress is that there just aren't a lot of pattern pieces, and it just makes it a lot faster to cut out the pattern at least. You still have to reverse them, so you end up cutting more pieces than you just see here, but at least the paper cutting part goes fast. Okay, so to adjust the neckline, first I draw a line about 1 inch down, and then I'm going to draw a shorter line along the neckline at 5/8 inch. From that point where they intersect here, I'm going to draw a line and blend it up to the shoulder. And then I have this little checkmark shaped chunk taken out. So you can see you've got the seam allowance there, and then you've got the rest of the neckline blending up to the shoulder. Now I'm going to remove the enormous cat. All right, to add gathers, I'm going to first mark the bust point right on the pattern. So an easy way to do this is just to hold the pattern up over yourself and put the center front right at the center front of your chest and find where the apex of your bust is and just mark it with a pencil. Now I'm going to draw a line up to the shoulder. Now I'm going to draw the seam allowance at the shoulder, which is a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And now I'm going to draw another line on each side. So we've got 3 lines here. You could do more if you want. I'm going to do 3. Then I cut up the line right up to that seam allowance, and then I make a little hinge. So I cut up to the seam allowance, and then I cut into the seam allowance, but I leave a tiny bit of paper there, so there's a little bit of a hinge. Then I do the same for the other lines. I cut along the other lines and just leave that little hinge right at the top, right at the seam line. Then I spread the pattern piece out to give a lot more fullness at the bottom. So I've chosen to add about 2 times the gathering here. So we're going to be taking up two times the fabric and gathering it into 1 times the fabric, if that makes sense. And I tape some paper underneath just to keep the whole thing stable. Use plenty of tape so you have a nice stable pattern piece to work with. And then redraw the bottom seam. You could use a curved ruler here if you want. Then you cut it right along that line, cut off any excess paper. And then finally, I'm going to mark the beginning and end of the gather. So I'm going to draw in little circles there, which I'll transfer onto my pattern later so I know where to gather. And then redraw the grain line. So you want to make sure that the grain line is on there exactly 45 degrees from the center front. So if you have a clear quilting ruler, that makes it really, really easy. You just line it up and draw that 45-degree line using the 45-degree line that's right on the ruler. So super, super easy. All right, so we've got our pattern all altered now. Looks a little funny, but this is going to create those beautiful gathers and the lowered neckline that I talked about. So next step is I'm going to cut this thing out. So I'm going to go do that and I'll be right back. All right, here's a quick tip for cutting. So this is the first tip I wanted to share today. You can use a quilting ruler to help you square up the grain line with the edge. So it's a little bit trickier to get the grain line right with a bias cut fabric. So using a quilting ruler will help you to really make sure that you're getting it exactly along the bias and your fabric isn't being cut off grain. So because the adjustments made the pattern pieces bigger, I'm worried that I'm not going to have enough fabric now. So this is how much fabric I have left. I have 3 more pieces to cut out. I don't know if I'm going to make it. Let's see. Oh my gosh, you guys, barely made it. Oh my gosh, look at this. Look how close we are to the edge. Oh my gosh. Whew. I'm breathing a sigh of relief because the fabric store is like 45 minutes away from my house. So thank goodness. You guys, that was a nail biter. But I have all my fabric cut out now. Let's see if I can show it here. Made use of pretty much every square inch of that fabric. And I am ready to sew. Let's put the dress together. So I thought we could chat while I get the machines all set up and threaded. So I was just kind of wondering, like, what would you guys have done in that situation if you were actually out of fabric? You couldn't fit it on there. The fabric store is 45 minutes away each way. Would you have ventured out to the fabric store, or would you have maybe used a different fabric for the lining on the inside, or maybe pieced together some of the scraps for the lining? I was considering all of those options, honestly, because I really didn't want to drive to the fabric store, but I ended up having enough. So what would you have done in that situation? Let me know down below. Okay, I'm all set up now on both my regular straight stitch machine over here and then on my serger, which I'm going to use to finish all the raw edges. And the first step that we're going to do here is stay stitching. I have my instructions here on my iPad. And the first thing we're going to do is stay stitch the necklines and the armholes. Oh, there's a big sunbeam right in my face. And that's to make sure that those areas, those curved areas, don't get stretched out. That's for the neckline is a little bit actually less of a problem because the dress is bias cut and it's a V-neck. So it's actually more along the straight grain than it normally would be, but we still want to stay stitch it. So that's where we're going to start. So the reason you stay stitch is so that any curved edges or any edges that go along the bias don't get stretched out. So anything that's not exactly on grain doesn't get stretched out. And that can happen often around necklines, sometimes around armholes, other curved areas. So any edge where that's likely to happen. So with bias cut garments, you might think that, well, even though it's going diagonally, the whole garment is cut on the bias, so it's not as big of an issue. And it's not maybe as big of an issue. Maybe it's not going along so close to the diagonal grain, but it's still an issue and it's still not cut on the straight grain. So you definitely want to stay stitch your edges. And as I sew, I'm making sure not to stretch out my fabric. So whenever I'm stay stitching, I make sure to hold the fabric gently so that I'm not stretching it as I sew because it's very easy to stretch out. All right, next I'm going to sew gathering stitches on all 4 fronts between the circles. So I marked those circles on the pattern, and now I'm going to sew 3 rows of gathering stitches along all 4 pieces. And I do 3 rows. I like to do 3 rows. I think it results in more even gathers, a little bit easier to handle than 2 rows for me. So I prefer 3 rows, and I leave long thread tails. So I have these long dangling thread tails that I'm going to be able to pull later in order to gather up that fabric. Now I'm going to pin the center fronts together, and I like to use pins especially right around where the seams join, just to make sure that it's really, really stable and those seams stay lined up so that when I actually stitch it together, there's a nice, very clear, clean join there. Then I stitch the bodice front to the skirt front and press. My second tip for you for stitching on the bias is when you have these long vertical seams, instead of using a straight stitch, you can use a narrow zigzag. And when you do that, it lets the seam actually stretch a little bit so that when you're wearing it, allows the bias to actually do what the bias is meant to do, which is to move and to stretch, rather than a straight stitch, which kind of holds it in place, and that can cause a lot of bunching. So if you've ever worn a bias cut dress that kind of bunches up around the hips or bunches up when you move around, that might be why. So a narrow zigzag, I do a 2.5 length, so same length as the straight stitch, and I do a 1 millimeter width. So very, very narrow. Next, I'll stitch the back bodice and the skirts together, and then I'll sew the front lining at the center front and join the outer dress at the shoulders. All right, it's starting to come together. Look at that. Almost looks like a dress. Oh my gosh, so cute. Really looking forward to wearing this. Okay, now we're going to use the burrito method to first attach the lining at the neckline and then to clean finish around each armhole. So the burrito method is a little tricky to see. It's a little bit, it might seem complicated the first time you do it. So if you haven't done the burrito method before, definitely watch the videos. We have 2 videos on the burrito method, depending on what type of garment you're doing it on, and we'll link them down below. They're awesome videos. They'll really help you if you've never done this before. So I'm not going to show the whole burrito method because we have those other videos for it. So that's what I'm going to be doing here. All right, our burrito method is done. Now I'm going to sew the side and the back seam. Remember to use that zigzag stitch. So remember, instead of using a straight stitch, I'm going to use a narrow zigzag stitch to let those side seams really stretch out when they need to. All right, this is the last major step for today, which is we're going to be finishing the hem on the lining. So finishing that raw edge that's at the bottom of that lining piece. So because I added gathers, I need to do something about those gathers, because obviously if I don't gather the lining piece the same way that I did the shell, it's not going to match up. So I'm going to gather up all those stitches so it matches the front, stitch it in place, and then finish that raw edge. And I'm going to use a serger to do that. And then I'm going to tack it at the sides just to hold that lining in place when I wear it. And now I'm going to leave it to hang overnight. So this brings me to my third tip. So when you're sewing a bias cut garment, especially something that's a little bit longer, like a dress or a skirt like this, you want to make sure to leave it to hang overnight before you hem it. So this takes a little bit more time, but the thing is with bias cut fabric, it does stretch, it does grow, and if you don't hang it overnight before you hem it, you don't really know what you're getting. You don't know how long it's going to be, you don't know if it's going to be uneven. The different pieces can stretch at different rates, so you just want to make sure that it's kind of settled the way it's going to be before you actually put the hem in. Good morning! All right, so we are ready to hem now. The dress has hung overnight, so the seams are able to just relax, and we've got the final kind of length here, so we can take a little bit off if we need to. So I'm going to have Ken help me. And the way we're going to do it is I'm going to try the dress on, and he is going to measure from the floor to where I want the hem to hit and just mark it all the way around, and then we'll trim it and then hem it, and the dress is going to be done. All right, so Ken's just measuring from the floor. I'm trying to stand up normally, stand up straight. He's measuring from the floor to basically the shortest point on the fabric, so that I can trim it all the way around and make sure that the hem is even. You'll find that with bias cut things, when you hang it overnight, it will often lengthen a little bit. That's just due to the way, bias hangs. So we're going to make sure that it's all even all the way around. And he's just marking with pins as he goes. And then once he's done, I'm going to take some chalk and actually draw the hem all the way around. Okay, now that I have my hem marked with pins, I'm just going to mark the hem with some chalk, or rather a Chocopel pen, my favorite from Clover. I love this. This is my favorite marker for fabric. And then I'm just going to trim and press, and then I'll be ready to sew. And sewing the hem. I wanted to show you guys something real quick on this. So remember that this fabric was ribbed. It had these diagonal ribs when you cut it on the straight grain, and when we cut it on the bias grain, that means the ribs are no longer diagonal. They're either going to be going horizontally or they're going to be going vertically. So I wanted to show you guys this so you get a sense of it. So hopefully you can see that, but notice how on one side you've got the ribs going vertically, and on the other side you've got the ribs going horizontally where it meets in the middle at the center front seam. And that might seem a little bit weird, but there's a reason for that. So you want your diagonal of the bias to be going in two different directions on each side. And the reason for that is that if your bias grain is going the same direction on both sides, there's a tendency for the garment to twist. It'll twist around your body. And so doing it on two different bias grains, one going this way and one going this way, so it meets in the middle like that, means that there'll be less twisting. However, when we have this diagonal rib or a diagonal pattern already on the garment, it's going to look like it's going in two different directions, which might not be a bad thing. I don't think it's even really noticeable, and even if it is, it's kind of like a stylistic choice, so we'll just go with it. And I should also mention that you don't really need to worry about that when you're cutting, as long as you're following the cutting layout. So definitely when you're sewing a bias garment, follow the cutting layout, because it's going to have you flipping the pieces, and that's not just to save fabric, but that so you have those grains meeting up in the middle like we just talked about. So one thing I noticed is that the edges on my garment are still rolling to the outside a little bit, even though I understitched, so along the neckline and a little bit along the armholes. So I just think this fabric is simultaneously very light and also a little bit strangely bulky, just because it has so much texture to it. I decided that I think it would look best if I edge stitch in addition to the understitching I tried before. So I'm going to edge stitch all along the edges of the neckline and along the armholes. So one other thing I want to mention, I did end up having to do a last minute change last night after I tried on the garment. So you might notice the shoulders look a little bit wider than normal on this dress. And the reason for that is that when I tried this dress on, the fabric had grown so much over the course of sewing it, and it was way too long in the bodice for me. So I ended up taking up the shoulders a little bit, or actually kind of a lot. And so because of that, it's a little bit wider at the shoulders than it normally would be. It's a little bit wider here, like around the armhole as well. Not so much that it's uncomfortable, but it just looks a little bit different. So you'll notice that on there. I think the lesson learned from this is definitely if you're sewing something on the bias in particular, you want to try it on as you go, because even if you make a muslin, you don't know how the fabric's going to behave. It could grow a lot, it could grow a little. And I think because this fabric has this kind of springy texture to it, it grew quite a lot. So lesson learned for me. All right, here it is. I'm so happy with how this garment turned out. I just love it. It's just so pretty. The color is so happy and so beautiful and so springtime-like for me. Is that a word, springtime-like? I don't know. But I really, really like it. And the shape, I really enjoy a bias cut dress. I find them just to be really beautiful, really, they just look nice on me, and I think they also are very comfortable. You know, you just slip them on, they have that stretch to them. It's the kind of thing that you can just, I don't know, you can just throw on. I can also layer it. I could wear a long sleeve shirt underneath in cooler weather. Really, really excited about this dress. All right, there were 3 really good tips I shared with you today for working with bias cut fabric, so let me just recap those for you. Number 1, when you're cutting, use a clear quilting ruler to help you square up the grain line to the edge of the fabric. Number 2, when you're sewing those long vertical seams, so like on a skirt, long seams that hang down, use a narrow zigzag instead of a straight stitch, and that way the seams can relax and they can stretch as you wear it. And the best thing is it won't get all bunched up at the hips that way. Number 3, make sure you let the garment hang overnight before you hem it. So bias cut fabrics can stretch over time, and this makes sure you get an even hem and you get it at the length that you want. I also want to share 3 really important lessons that I myself learned during this project. And number 1, unsurprisingly, buy extra fabric anytime you're modifying a pattern. I didn't even think about this. I knew I was going to modify this pattern. I didn't even think about getting extra fabric, and it almost ruined the project for me because I came this close to running out, this close. Number 2, when you're sewing on the bias, it's a good idea to fit as you go. So you never really know how much a fabric is going to stretch and grow when you're sewing on the bias. And even though I tried it on my body, I tried it a little bit, I wasn't really examining the fit, and it just ended up way too long in the bodice, and I had to make those last minute alterations, and it kind of affected the final look a little bit more than I like. So definitely try it on as you go as much as you're able to. And then 3, and finally, this is the big one, and it's related to the last one, which is respond to your fabric. So every fabric behaves a little bit differently. So you really just have to anticipate that. And you also have to be willing to make changes when it doesn't do what you thought it would. Fabric is always the biggest unknown variable when you're sewing, so you just gotta learn to respond to those curveballs and be willing to do that. And remember, if you wanna try this hack yourself on the gray dress, our YouTube subscribers get a 50% off lifetime discount at seamwork.com/go/YouTube50, and I'll put a link in the description below and also a link to the pattern. Let me know if you enjoyed making this dress with me. I absolutely love it. I'm so thrilled with it. I had a great time. I will see you next week.